They say every neighborhood has that one person who takes the HOA a little too seriously. The one who thinks they're the sheriff of suburbia, patrolling with more authority than they actually have. In our neighborhood, that person had a name, Doyle Mason. And Doyle didn't just act like he had a badge. He strutted around like the whole block was his personal kingdom, clipboard tucked under one arm, smartphone always ready to snap a picture of what he called violations. The thing was, Doyle wasn't elected. Nobody had appointed him. He wasn't even on the board. He just decided that being the HOA patrol was his life's calling. And the rest of us were supposed to bow to his rules. I first noticed him the summer I turned 16. Most mornings, I'd stumble into the kitchen, half awake, pouring cereal while Grandpa sat on the porch rocking slowly, his mug of black coffee steaming in his hand. Grandpa was the kind of man who carried stillness like armor. A Korean War veteran with creased hands and sharp eyes, he didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened. He was the opposite of Doyle, measured, patient, calm as stone. That particular morning, though, Grandpa muttered something under his breath. I followed his gaze out the kitchen window and froze. "There he goes again," Grandpa said quietly. And sure enough, Doyle Mason was scaling our backyard fence like some clumsy burglar at 5:30 in the morning. Boots scraping against the wood, breath puffing white in the cool air, and that phone clenched like a weapon. "What's he doing?" I whispered, cereal spoon halfway to my mouth. Grandpa didn't answer right away. He just rocked once, slow and steady, before speaking. "Taking pictures of the tomatoes," he said. Sure enough, when Doyle landed in our yard, he crouched low by the row of tomato plants Grandpa tended with care. Snap! Snap! The sound of his camera shutter cut through the dawn like nails on a chalkboard. I couldn't believe it. Is he serious? He's trespassing just to take pictures of vegetables? Grandpa raised his hand, a subtle motion that meant stay put. "Patience, son," he murmured. "Let a fool show himself long enough, and he'll write his own ending." That was Grandpa's way. Where I was hot-headed, ready to storm outside and throw Doyle off the property, Grandpa preferred the long game. And in truth, this wasn't the first time Doyle had crossed a line. Twice before, we caught him poking around by the shed, rattling the handle like he expected to uncover some dark secret. Once, he even had the gall to crouch near our porch steps, measuring the angle of the railing with a plastic protractor. According to Doyle, our wood stain was not in compliance with HOA aesthetic guidelines. When Grandpa reported these incidents to the HOA president, Linda Clay, her response was always the same, a polite smile and a dismissive shrug. "Oh, Doyle's just enthusiastic," she said once, brushing the matter off like a leaf on her designer sweater. "He cares about the neighborhood." Enthusiastic. That was her word. But what Doyle was doing wasn't enthusiasm, it was harassment. It was trespassing. In fact, Grandpa had even pulled out the state code one evening, pointing at the lines in the law book like scripture. North Carolina Statute 14-159.13, he told me. It's a crime to enter private property without permission. But the sheriff's office told us something different when Grandpa called to report it. Unless we caught Doyle red-handed and pressed charges right there on the spot, it would be Doyle's word against ours. And Doyle had mastered the art of twisting stories to his advantage. So every morning, Grandpa sat in his rocker, and Doyle prowled around like a self-righteous hawk, circling the neighborhood. He measured grass with rulers. He timed how long trash bins sat at the curb. He even peeked through people's windows when he thought no one was looking. Everyone hated it, but nobody stood up to him. Nobody except Grandpa. That morning, I'll admit, I was itching to throw the door open and scream at Doyle to get off our property. But one look at Grandpa's steady expression kept me frozen in place. His eyes tracked Doyle the way a hunter tracks prey, calm but unrelenting. Finally, Doyle tucked his phone back into his pocket, climbed the fence with the same clumsy scramble, and vanished down the street. Grandpa didn't move a muscle. "He'll be back," he said simply, rocking in his chair. The way he said it sent a chill through me. Not fear exactly, but a sense that something inevitable was building. And he was right. Doyle Mason wasn't finished with us, not by a long shot. What he didn't know, though, was that Grandpa wasn't finished with him either. Because when you push a patient man too far, you don't just poke a bear. You wake it up. And Doyle was about to learn that lesson the hard way. If Grandpa was right, and he usually was, Doyle wasn't done with us. And sure enough, it didn't take long before his shadow crossed our yard again. The first time, I thought maybe I'd imagined it. I was helping Grandpa clean out the shed, tossing old garden tools onto the grass, when I heard the faint rattle of metal. I turned, and there was Doyle, crouched low by the shed door, his hand on the latch like he was about to pull it open. "Hey!" I shouted, dropping the rake in my hand. Doyle jerked upright, eyes wide for just a second before his face twisted into that smug, self-important mask he always wore. "Inspection," he said smoothly, brushing off his khakis as though he had any right to be there. HOA regulations clearly state that storage structures must be maintained to standard. I received a complaint. I stepped toward him, fists balled. "From who?" "Yourself?" Grandpa's voice came sharp and steady from behind me. "Back away from the shed, Doyle." Doyle smirked, but he did step back. He always did when Grandpa spoke. Something in Grandpa's tone had a weight that Doyle couldn't match. Still, Doyle couldn't resist tossing over his shoulder as he left, "You'll be hearing from the board." That night, Grandpa actually did call the HOA president, Linda Clay. I stood nearby, watching him on the phone, his posture upright, his voice calm. "Yes, ma'am," he said evenly. "I'm telling you Doyle Mason trespassed onto my property." I found him with his hand on my shed door. I couldn't hear Linda's reply, but Grandpa's face didn't change. "No, ma'am. This isn't enthusiasm. This is criminal trespass. I want it documented." Another pause. "Well then," Grandpa said after a long silence, "I'll be documenting it myself." He hung up without another word. When he turned to me, I asked, "So? What did she say?" Grandpa's mouth pressed into a thin line. "She said Doyle cares about the community. That he's only trying to help." I couldn't believe it. "Help? By breaking into our shed?" Grandpa leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. "When people in power protect the wrong man, son, that tells you two things. 1, the rules don't mean what they say. And 2, it's time to stop playing by them." I thought he was exaggerating, but over the next week Doyle only grew bolder. One morning, I woke to find him standing inside our yard again, crouched by the porch railing with a tape measure. Grandpa didn't even rise from his rocker. He just watched. Doyle muttered, non-compliant angle, scribbling in his clipboard like he was some kind of building inspector. Another time, I caught him in our side yard, peeking through the narrow basement window. My skin crawled at the sight. "What the hell are you doing?" I yelled, charging toward him. Doyle straightened, feigning innocence. "Garbage placement. Against regulations. We didn't even keep garbage on that side of the house." He was just snooping. This time, Grandpa called the sheriff's office. I sat with him at the kitchen table as he explained the situation, voice calm but clipped. "Yes, officer. He's entered my property without permission multiple times. Yes, I've asked the HOA to intervene. Yes, I want this on record." The deputy on the other end must have sympathized, but when Grandpa hung up, he shook his head. "They say unless we catch him in the act and file charges right there, it's a gray area," Grandpa muttered. "Our word against his." "That's insane," I said. "He's clearly trespassing." Grandpa's eyes narrowed. "Which is why next time, we'll catch him in the act." From that moment, I knew something had shifted. Grandpa didn't hum tunes when he worked in the garage anymore. He didn't talk about the weather, or the tomatoes, or the fishing trip he always promised we'd take. He was quiet, focused, like a man sharpening a blade you couldn't see. For 3 days, the garage door stayed closed. I'd hear the buzz of tools, the occasional clang of metal, and Grandpa's low whistle drifting through the crack at the bottom. When I asked what he was working on, he'd just smile faintly. "Just making some adjustments," he said. I should have known then what he meant. Grandpa wasn't the kind of man to wait around for justice to arrive neatly wrapped. No, when the law failed, when the HOA played dumb, when neighbors whispered but refused to act, Grandpa acted. And Doyle Mason, our self-appointed patrol, was about to find out what it meant to trespass on the wrong porch. By the end of that week, Doyle Mason had turned himself into a ghost that haunted every corner of our property. No matter the time of day, it felt like his eyes, or at least his camera lens, were on us. If it wasn't him rattling the shed door, it was him crouched near the tomato plants again, muttering about unsightly garden structures. If it wasn't the railing, it was the grass length. I swear, if Grandpa sneezed too loud on the porch, Doyle probably wrote it down in his little clipboard like a violation of the noise ordinance. I'd never seen Grandpa angry in the loud, red-faced way people usually get. But I recognized the change in him all the same. His eyes narrowed more. His silences stretched longer. His rocker creaked slower and deeper, like every push carried weight. Finally, one evening, he set his coffee mug down with a quiet clink and said, "Time to fix the gate." "The gate?" I repeated. I thought maybe he meant reinforcing it or replacing the hinges Doyle kept rattling when he climbed over. But Grandpa's eyes glinted with something different. Something sharper. "Want to help me in the garage, son?" he asked. That's how it began. For the next 3 days, the garage became a place of secrets. Grandpa spread out blueprints on his workbench, pages curling with notes in his sharp handwriting. Wires coiled across the table. Tools lined up in perfect order. He worked with the kind of quiet determination I usually only saw when he sharpened his hunting knife before deer season. "Hand me that clamp," he'd say, and I'd pass it wordlessly. "Check the voltage on that meter," he'd murmur, and I'd squint at the numbers, reading them aloud while he adjusted knobs and wires. He never explained fully what he was building. But by the second day, I understood enough. The iron gate at the end of our driveway wasn't just going to be a barrier anymore, it was going to carry a sting. "Is this legal?" I asked, watching as he tested a small section of wire that sparked faintly before humming. Grandpa didn't even look up. "Low voltage. Under state code, as long as it's posted with clear warning signs, it's legal." He tapped a laminated sheet pinned to the wall. It was an official permit, stamped and signed. Got it approved 2 years ago when folks kept trying to cut through my property to get to the creek. Never thought I'd actually need it for the likes of Doyle. The way he said Doyle's name, flat, like he was describing a broken tool, made me shiver more than if he'd shouted. By the 3rd day, the gate was finished. It looked ordinary enough, the same wrought iron bars and sturdy lock as before. But if you looked closer, you'd notice the faint silver wiring laced along the bars, the kind that caught the light just so. Grandpa stood back, wiping his hands on a rag, and nodded once. "That'll do." Then he drove 2 posts into the ground on either side of the gate and hung bright yellow signs on each. The black letters screamed, "Warning, electrified gate. Trespassers will be shocked." I chuckled nervously. "Think Doyle can read?" Grandpa slid the sign into place with steady hands. "Doesn't matter. The law says I have to warn him. After that, what happens is on him." That night, as we sat on the porch, the gate gleamed faintly under the streetlight. To anyone else, it was just another part of the yard. But to me, it looked like a trap waiting to be sprung. "Won't the HOA come after you for this?" I asked quietly. Grandpa sipped his coffee, eyes fixed on the fence line. "The HOA can regulate flower colors, mailbox shapes, and how long a car sits in the driveway. What they can't regulate is trespassing." He leaned back in his rocker, the old wood creaking beneath him. "If Doyle wants to keep climbing into my yard, he's going to learn something about consequences." There was no anger in his tone. Just certainty. And sure enough, the very next morning, Before the sun even broke the horizon, I heard the telltale creak of wood. The fence. I rushed to the window, heart pounding, and there he was again, Doyle Mason. Clipboard under one arm, phone in the other, muttering to himself about violations. Grandpa didn't even shift in his chair. He just murmured, "Patience." Doyle's boots crunched on the gravel as he approached the gate. He reached out, gloved hand gripping the cold iron. And that's when the trap snapped shut. The morning air was still cool when it happened. The street was quiet, the only sound the low hum of crickets fading as dawn crept in. From my place at the window, I could see Doyle creeping across our yard like a man on a mission. His clipboard bobbed under one arm, his phone gripped tight in the other. "Violation, violation," he muttered under his breath like some deranged meter maid. His boots crunched on the gravel, his glasses fogged in the humidity, and his eyes narrowed at Grandpa's tomato plants as if they were a national security threat. Beside me, Grandpa didn't move from his rocker. He just lifted his mug of coffee, sipped once, and said, "Watch closely, son." My pulse thundered in my ears as Doyle approached the gate. He squatted low, took a picture of the warning sign, and scoffed. "Illegal," I heard him hiss, shaking his head. "Completely against HOA standards." Then he reached for the iron bars. It happened in an instant. The moment his gloved hand wrapped around the metal, the gate came alive with a low snap of energy. A faint crackle split the air, followed by Doyle's yelp, loud, sharp, and utterly ridiculous. "Yee, ow!" His whole body jolted like he grabbed a nest of hornets. He stumbled backward, arms flailing, his clipboard flying into the dirt. His phone clattered onto the gravel, face down. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle my laugh, but it was useless. The sound that came out was half choke, half snort. Doyle, meanwhile, scrambled to his feet, limping and cursing under his breath. He clutched his wrist as though he'd been branded with fire. His shirt had a streak of dirt across the front where he'd landed, and his face was red as a boiled tomato. Grandpa didn't flinch. He leaned back in his chair, eyes glinting, and said softly that, son, was the sound of justice. By mid-morning, the entire street knew. Neighbors whispered at the ends of their driveways, pretending to collect the newspaper while sneaking glances toward our yard. Word spread fast. Doyle Mason had been zapped on Thompson's gate. I overheard Mrs. Whitaker, who lived 2 doors down, muttering to her husband, "Serves him right. That man measured my hydrangeas last week." Her husband just chuckled. Maybe next time he'll mind his own business. It became the day's entertainment. People grinned as Doyle limped past in his khakis, trying to keep his composure while his hair still frizzed from static. But of course, Doyle couldn't just let it go. By noon, he was already spinning the story, telling anyone who would listen that Grandpa had installed some sort of illegal death trap. He waved his scratched clipboard like it was evidence. "That gate nearly killed me," he cried in outrage to Mr. Sanders across the street. "It's a lawsuit waiting to happen. Completely unregulated. Do you know how many volts that was? Thousands." Mr. Sanders just raised an eyebrow. "Looked like a warning sign to me." Doyle sputtered, "Signs don't make it legal." But everyone knew. They'd all seen his antics before, snooping in backyards, snapping photos of kids' bikes, peeking through curtains at night. Nobody was surprised he'd finally gotten caught on the wrong side of the fence. When I asked Grandpa later if he thought Doyle would actually press charges, he just shrugged. "He can try," Grandpa said. "The law's on my side. Signs are posted. Permits in place." He got exactly what he deserved. I couldn't help grinning. "You really think this'll stop him?" Grandpa's rocker creaked as he leaned forward, setting his mug down. His eyes were sharp, steady. "No. Men like Doyle don't stop. They double down." He was right again. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the cicadas started their endless song, I caught sight of Doyle pacing the sidewalk in front of our yard. He moved slow, dragging his foot like it still hurt, but his eyes burned with something darker now. Not embarrassment. Not humiliation, but determination. He wasn't finished with us. And though I didn't know it then, the zap at the gate was just the opening act. Doyle Mason was about to drag the entire neighborhood into a war of pride, law, and stubbornness. Grandpa, though? He just poured himself another cup of coffee, settled into his chair, and muttered, "Let him come." The day after Doyle's run-in with the gate, flyers appeared in every mailbox on Maple Court. Emergency HOA meeting, attendance mandatory. No one had to ask who called it. When Grandpa and I walked into the clubhouse that evening, the room buzzed with a nervous energy. Folding chairs scraped across the linoleum floor, neighbors whispering in low tones, some stifling laughter. Everyone already knew why they were there. At the front of the room sat Linda Clay, the HOA president. She wore her pearls, as always, and that polished smile that never quite reached her eyes. Beside her, slumped dramatically with his arm in a sling, sat Doyle Mason. The moment we walked in, Doyle pointed a trembling finger across the room. "There he is," he barked. "That man is endangering the entire neighborhood." Grandpa didn't so much as pause. He walked slowly to a chair near the middle row, sat down, and folded his hands on his knee. Calm, steady, unshaken. I slid into the seat beside him, pulse racing. Linda rapped her gavel. "Order, please." This meeting was called to address a serious safety concern. Doyle leapt to his feet, milking every ounce of drama from his sling. "This so-called neighbor has rigged an electrified weapon at his gate. I barely survived an attack on my own life. This man is a menace." "Sit down, Doyle," Linda interrupted, though her smile never faltered. "We'll let everyone have their turn." Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Some neighbors shook their heads, others looked at Grandpa with quiet curiosity. When Doyle finally sat, Grandpa rose. He didn't shout. He didn't wave his arms. He simply placed a folded paper on the table in front of Linda and said in that gravelly voice that carried through the room, "That is a state-issued electrical permit. Fully legal. Fully signed. And required warning notices are posted." Linda glanced at the paper, her lips twitching, but Doyle shot up again, sputtering. "Legal or not, it's aggressive. It's against the spirit of community living." That's when Grandpa leaned forward, his voice low but sharp. "Regulate? You can regulate mailbox colors, yes. You can regulate hedge heights. But you cannot regulate trespassing. And you cannot protect a man who violates the law every time he climbs a neighbor's fence." The room shifted. You could feel it. Neighbors who had been silent began to stir. A woman in the back raised her hand. "Doyle came into my backyard last month. Said he needed to measure my shrubs. I thought it was just me." Another man spoke up, his face red. "He photographed my kids' bicycles and told me they were an eyesore." Someone else muttered, "He tried to open my shed door too." Voices rose, one after another, stories piling on like logs on a fire. Doyle's face grew redder with every accusation. He sputtered, stammered, tried to wave it off. "Lies! All lies. I was conducting inspections." "Inspections?" one neighbor scoffed. "You don't even sit on the board." The tide had turned. Linda's gavel cracked against the table, her fake smile cracking just slightly. "Order! This is not the place for accusations. We are here to discuss Mr. Thompson's." But Grandpa cut her off, his voice ringing like a hammer. "No, ma'am. We are here to discuss Doyle's obsession. You've let him run around unchecked, poking into people's yards, harassing families, acting like he owns the neighborhood. And now he's found out what happens when you trespass one time too many." Silence filled the room. Then, slowly, a few claps broke out. They grew louder, more confident, until half the neighbors were applauding. Doyle sank back into his chair, clutching his sling like it might shield him from the humiliation. Linda tapped her gavel again, her voice tight. "That's enough. We'll table this discussion for now." But the damage was done. Doyle wasn't the patrol anymore, he was the laughingstock. And Grandpa, without raising his voice once, had shifted the whole neighborhood against him. When we left the meeting, Doyle glared daggers at us from the doorway, his face twisted with hate. Grandpa didn't look back. He just said to me, "A man cornered by his own lies will always come back swinging. Stay ready." And I knew then, Doyle Mason wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The days after the HOA meeting felt different. Neighbors waved at Grandpa more often. A few even stopped by to drop off pies or jars of jam, subtle ways of saying thank you without stirring up more drama. Maple Court seemed lighter, freer, like someone had opened the windows after a long, musty winter. But Doyle Mason wasn't done. Every morning, his dented pickup truck rolled slowly down the block, creeping past our driveway, headlights off even in the dim light of dawn. He'd stop just long enough to make us uncomfortable, then drive on. Other times, he parked across the street, scribbling notes in that ever-present clipboard of his. Like a vulture circling, Grandpa muttered from his rocker, thermos of black coffee in hand. "He's waiting for something." I tried to brush it off, but truth be told, my stomach stayed knotted. Doyle looked more unhinged each day. His sling was gone, probably never needed in the first place, but his glare had sharpened into something colder, hungrier. Then came the third night. I woke to a faint clink outside my window. At first, I thought it was just branches scratching the glass. But then came the muffled crunch of boots in gravel. My pulse spiked. I slid from bed and peered through the blinds. There he was. Doyle Mason, crouched at the gate, flashlight clenched between his teeth, bolt cutters in hand. His face was twisted in determination, muttering curses under his breath. "He's actually going to break through," I whispered. I turned to wake Grandpa, but he was already awake. He sat in his rocker on the porch, barely visible in the moonlight, as if he'd been expecting this exact moment. In one hand he held his thermos. In the other, a small black remote. "Watch this, kid," he whispered to me, eyes locked on Doyle. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. Doyle clamped the cutters onto the steel gate, grunting as he pressed down. The metal groaned but held firm. He reset his grip and tried again, sweat gleaming on his forehead. That's when Grandpa clicked the remote. BZZZT. The hum of electricity surged through the wires, and Doyle's body jolted like he'd just grabbed a hornet's nest. His flashlight clattered to the ground, beam spinning wildly as he yelped and stumbled backward into the mud. "Son of a..." Doyle howled, clutching his hand. He tried to steady himself, but his boots slipped, sending him crashing onto his side. The bolt cutters landed beside him with a heavy thud. From the porch, Grandpa calmly sipped his coffee. "Trespassing again," he muttered. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My 75-year-old grandfather sat there like a sheriff in some old western, steady as stone, while Doyle flailed in the dirt. Then Grandpa pulled out his phone, camera already rolling. He zoomed in, capturing every curse, every stumble, every muddy slip in glorious 1080p. "Smile for the camera, Doyle," Grandpa said quietly, though I doubt Doyle heard him over his own screaming. But instead of retreating, Doyle did something I didn't expect. He scrambled up, fumbling with his own phone, and jabbed at the screen with trembling fingers. Seconds later, his voice rose into the night. 911. "Yes, I'm under attack. Attempted murder. My neighbor is trying to kill me with an illegal electrified trap." My jaw dropped. He was actually calling the cops. Grandpa didn't move. He just let the camera roll. "False police report," he murmured, almost to himself. "That'll stack nicely." Sure enough, not 5 minutes later, the wash of red and blue lights filled the street. Sirens cut through the still night as 2 patrol cars rolled up, tires crunching on gravel. Officers spilled out, hands hovering over their holsters. Doyle ran to them, waving his arms wildly. "There! Arrest him. He's trying to electrocute me. He set a trap." The officers looked from Doyle, muddy, trembling, bolt cutters at his feet, to Grandpa, who sat calmly on his porch with his coffee. "Sir," one officer said cautiously, "is there an active electrical device on that gate?" "Yes," Grandpa replied evenly. "Registered, permitted, posted with warnings. Here's the paperwork." Without standing, he slid the laminated permit across the porch table, then handed over his phone with the video still playing. The officers watched Doyle climb, cut, and fry himself in full HD. One officer looked up, deadpan. "So, you trespassed?" Doyle sputtered. "No! I was conducting an HOA inspection." "Inspection?" The other officer raised a brow. "At midnight? With bolt cutters?" The law couldn't have been clearer. Doyle wasn't just trespassing, he was committing vandalism, attempted theft, and now filing a false report. The officers cuffed him right there in the glow of the humming gate. Neighbors, roused by the sirens, had gathered in their driveways. And for the first time, no one whispered. They clapped. Grandpa leaned back in his chair, eyes glinting, and said softly to me, "Sometimes justice just needs a little electricity." The cruiser door slammed, the sound echoing down Maple Court like the closing of a cell. Doyle Mason sat inside, wrists cuffed, his face pressed against the window. His eyes darted wildly from neighbor to neighbor, searching for sympathy, but all he found were smirks and shaking heads. For once, the neighborhood wasn't hiding behind curtains or whispering from porches. People stood proudly in their driveways, arms crossed, watching the so-called HOA patrol get hauled off like a common criminal. A few neighbors even clapped. One whistled. Someone muttered, "About time." Doyle's voice rose from inside the cruiser, muffled but frantic. "You're all blind. That old man is dangerous. He's a menace to this community." Nobody cared. The officers exchanged a glance before sliding into their car. Tires crunched on the gravel, and the red and blue lights rolled down the street until the night was quiet again. Grandpa didn't move. He sat back in his rocker, calm as ever, sipping the last of his black coffee. I stood beside him, heart still racing from the chaos. "Grandpa," I whispered, "is it over?" He gave a low chuckle. "For Doyle? Oh, it's just beginning." And he was right. The next morning, by sunrise, word had spread. Maple Court wasn't buzzing, it was on fire with gossip. Every neighbor seemed to have their own Doyle story now that the dam had broken. Mrs. Hanley confessed he once accused her of unapproved wind chimes. Mr. Porter swore Doyle tried to measure the angle of his gutters. The Garcias said Doyle photographed their kid's basketball hoop at least 3 times. It was like everyone had been waiting for someone else to speak first. Now, with Doyle exposed, the floodgates opened. Grandpa didn't say much. He didn't need to. He just listened, nodded, and let the stories stack higher and higher. Doyle's reputation had flipped overnight, from self-appointed protector of Maple Court to its biggest joke. The HOA in shambles. By the end of the week, the HOA board had no choice but to act. An official notice went out, Doyle Mason was banned from all HOA activities pending investigation. Linda Clay's polished smile had cracked, she no longer defended him in public. Rumor was, she'd spent the emergency meeting dodging calls from angry residents. Too many people had receipts, pictures, texts, complaints brushed aside. Linda couldn't sweep Doyle's behavior under the rug anymore. It didn't take long before whispers about a recall vote started spreading. The same neighbors who once nodded politely at Linda's every word were now asking whether Maple Court needed new leadership. Grandpa? He never attended those side meetings. He stayed on the porch, rocking slow, watching it all unravel like he'd seen it 100 times before. HOAs, he said one night, are like weeds. They spread fast if you let them. But sometimes all it takes is pulling up the loudest one to give the whole yard breathing room. Doyle's return. 2 weeks later, Doyle reappeared. No pickup truck. No clipboard. Just a defeated man walking down Maple Court, head low, eyes hidden behind dark glasses. He didn't strut anymore, he shuffled. Neighbors paused their yard work, watching him like he was some ghost drifting through. No one waved. No one greeted him. He stopped once in front of our gate. For a second, I thought he might try something again. My chest tightened. But Doyle didn't move closer. He just stared at the bright yellow sign, "Electrified gate, trespassers will be shocked," and his shoulders slumped. Then he turned and kept walking. Grandpa never even looked up from his paper. "That," he murmured, "is the look of a man who's lost his audience." A quiet victory. Life slowly returned to normal. Neighbors tended their gardens without glancing over their shoulders. Kids played basketball in driveways without Doyle snapping photos. The street felt lighter. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky orange, I sat beside Grandpa on the porch. He rocked in silence, sipping coffee like he always did. "You knew this would happen," I said finally. "Didn't you?" He smiled faintly, eyes still on the horizon. "Son, you don't fight fire with fire. You let a fool build his own bonfire and watch him dance in the flames." We sat there a long while, the gate humming softly in the dusk, the neighborhood peaceful at last. And Doyle Mason, the man who thought he could police the world, was nothing more than a cautionary tale told over fences and backyard cookouts. Grandpa didn't gloat. He didn't brag. He just leaned back in his chair, content. Because sometimes justice doesn't come in a courtroom or a headline. Sometimes justice comes from a rocking chair, a steady hand, and just enough electricity to remind a man where the line is drawn.